Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. This episode is all about rethinking what we may see as standard practice, especially in an at-will state within the United States, but just generally speaking, go with me on this. We're going to be rethinking 2 weeks notice, and that is thanks to Robert Glazer, who is our guest this week, and his book. So let me tell you a little bit about Robert. He's the founder and chairman of the board of Acceleration Partners, a global partner marketing agency, and the recipient of numerous industry and company culture awards, including Glassdoor's Employees' Choice Awards 2 years in a row. He is the author of the inspirational newsletter Friday Forward and the #1 Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and international best-selling author of 5 books: Elevate, Friday Forward, How to Thrive in the Virtual Workplace, Moving to Outcomes and Performance Partnerships. And he is a sought-after speaker by companies and organizations around the world and is the host of the Elevate podcast. Robert, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Traci.
Of course. So we, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about rethinking 2 weeks notice. And this is your fifth. Is this your 6th book then, or is this your 5th? I'm not.
It's the 6th. Yeah.
The 6th. Okay.
Yeah.
So you are actually
what I lack in quality, I make up in quantity. So.
I love it. Well, the reason why I'm really excited for this episode is because I think I might have shared with you, but a big focus that I have in terms of my podcast and in terms of our mission really is to help people think differently, especially within the HR function. And I think that rethinking 2 weeks notice and this book that you've written really helps to do that. To me, while reading it, there was a lot of insights on how we can transform thinking, how we can challenge the status quo. And that's something that I hold very near and dear to my heart.
This is defined by the status quo now for decades. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we start with 2 weeks notice and what the problem is and why I guess maybe you were inspired to write this book.
Yeah. So the problem is that the nature of our workplace has entirely changed, from these places that we're going to work forever. And there's the expectation that we'll work there ever, more like a marriage, right? To something that is shorter term and more transactional. And yet, we approach the end of a work thing like we do a marriage and not a sports contract, which is like, hey, we had a good 2-year run here, and now we're both going to reevaluate what we're doing. And people are still running that same playbook because they don't know anything different, and it doesn't help the culture, and it doesn't meet the needs of our time. And so my story is like, look, I was building a company. We were focused on having a great culture. We won 30 Best Places to Work awards. And then when people were going to leave, like, they were giving 2 weeks notice. And I was like, this sucks and feels totally incongruous with what we're trying to do. So we asked ourselves, to challenge the status quo, like what could we do differently? And I came across Patty McCord's work and what they were doing at Netflix, and they were giving people 6-month severance and telling them to go be from Netflix. And I loved a lot of what she was doing. But I'm like, look, we're this little startup. I can't afford to, just pay everyone 6 months. So how could we do this differently? And it led to kind of an experiment, which led to eventually to our first open transition, and then eventually the open transition program.
And first of all, thank you. We'll definitely get into that, the open transition program. I'm curious though, when you think about your own experience as a hiring manager, as a leader, can you like reflect on points where you were blindsided by someone quitting, and maybe you can like relate to that breakdown, which is like the emotional side of that, equating that to like the end of a marriage versus a sports contract?
Yeah, like imagine if your partner came to you and said, "Look, I'm leaving in 2 weeks and I'm moving to a new city with a new partner." You'd be like, But this is what people think they have to do. So you have someone you've mentored, you have someone you work with, and and their parents told them that this is, what you do, and you don't say anything. And so
Yeah.
they have doctor's appointments and they have stuff, and they were out, and then suddenly like it's kind of like you had a cheating spouse. You're like, oh, then they were at the hotel, and then they went on,
Totally.
like all these memories come back and they replay differently, and it can completely ruin the entire relationship. And even if that person, well, they haven't asked you for a reference now, but
Mm.
for your next job, they might reach out, and you're like, oh, she was great, but man, she just left me high and dry at the end and really kind of broke my trust. And it's not Traci's fault. Like that's the system, but it's I don't think people realize how suboptimal an outcome is. It's bad for the employee. You may not think so now, but in 2 years, when you have no references from that company, right? Or there's a back channel reference that you don't even know about that sort of becomes a blocker of your career. And
Mhm.
most people, 2 weeks isn't enough time to barely replace the person or start interviewing, or somehow it's this social norm. But in critical positions, like it's not enough time.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, and this is why I think in some countries we see longer notice periods. And I know you kind of touch
Right, they're
on that.
statutory. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
It doesn't it's still the same problem, right? So
yes.
so Traci kind of tells me she wants to leave, and I can force her to work for 3 months or send her for gardening leave. But a lot of this is about how you head off some of these things and solve them earlier before they result in a departure.
Yeah, totally. And maybe this is actually a perfect segue into the open transition program because this is all about new ways of handling these departures. So, do you want
Yeah.
to walk us through a little bit of that?
Sure. There's 4 tenets to an open transition program. And then the goal is that you can have people working at your company who you know are leaving. It is what it sounds like. You can call it whatever you want, but that it's a transition program. You enter it, you continue to work at the company while you're looking for your new job and focusing on kind of moving forward. And there's 4 components, right? There's this psychological safety. So there's these discussions and meetings and feedback loops to try to have open dialogue and head off some of these problems earlier. One of the things, we can get into the objections, or people like, this doesn't work, you got to let people go, they're toxic. And I'm like, no, you're like, I'm talking about, like, if it's now March 2025, I'm talking about a conversation in March 2024. You're talking about where we are in March 2025 that could have totally changed this trajectory, because we had a couple chance to have conversations that we didn't have. And now,
Mm.
yes, you're at the point where everyone's pissed and it's irredeemable. There's open communication. Again, we have regular check-ins, town halls. I don't love anonymous feedback, but things that we can kind of collect to make sure, like, what problems we have. There's this commitment to mutual respect. Kind of addressing performance and potential exit discussion empathetically. And then there's this commitment to mutually beneficial outcomes, to say, look, like, just because Traci isn't working out on our sales team doesn't mean I can't support Traci as a person and help her to land on her feet in the next way possible. I think these things are not mutually exclusive. And there's a psychological phenomenon, I think, that happens particularly from the manager, which is, we're going to pick on Traci because she's here. So,
Yes.
but Traci's on my team. I love Traci. Traci's been at 50% of quota on my sales team for 4 quarters now. So anyone in sales who's paying attention knows that this isn't working. So what do I do if Traci's performing really badly and I really like Traci and I know I have to have a really uncomfortable discussion? My brain can't handle that. It's this concept of cognitive dissonance. So I need to bring these disparate thoughts better, that Traci's a great person, she's doing a bad job. My brain does it the wrong way, which it starts to, let's ostracize Traci, right? So look, she's late again. She blew another deal. She's really a bad person. So that way it makes it easier for
Easier.
me to do the
Mhm.
bad thing, right? Which is, I know I have to fire Traci or tell her this isn't working out. Versus maybe on the flip side, using that relationship and being like, Traci, like, love you. You are awesome. We both know that this isn't working and this can't go on forever. So let's sit down and have a conversation and talk about, like, what some potential outcomes would be, and lean into that relationship rather than make it easy on yourself by completely cutting off the relationship and turning Traci into this horrible, irredeemable object.
Yeah. Ooh. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with that. First of all, I love that we have an example here because it's real. Like these things
Yeah.
happen and the cognitive dissonance is real. I can say for sure I've heard managers speak this way, because it is so much easier to have all of these things that are wrong with the person to make it easier to let them go. And the difficult thing, the thing, let's say, that requires a lot more maturity and also accountability as a leader, is to recognize that you might really, really appreciate someone, but they just maybe are not the right fit for the role on your team in that particular time. And it
And they
does.
probably know that.
Yes, they
Right? Yeah.
probably know that, right, and they're just like, hopefully they don't notice that
Yeah.
this is happening.
Or
Yeah.
like, maybe please put me out of my
Right,
misery.
right.
Right? Yeah.
Just exactly. Just call it for me. Tell me what you're going to give me from severance. Like,
Yeah.
how are we going to make this work? I think part of that, like knowing that there's a level of maturity and emotional intelligence that someone has to have in order to be able to go the hard route, let's say, and really
Yeah.
be self-aware and also be transparent and upfront. I think that does require some level of ownership, that here a leader is in a situation where they have to just own it, and they
Yeah.
have to figure out, okay, what do they need for their team, and how do they have a conversation with someone that they would hope their leader would have with them. And when that happens, I mean, I think a lot of this, coming back to the psychological safety tenant that you mentioned, I think also that does have a cultural impact, in the sense that if the organization's culture prioritizes that type of
100%.
transparency,
Yeah.
right? Like that type of
You cannot
psychological
run
safety.
this software on a bad hardware, right? Like,
Right,
this is,
right.
yeah.
Like it kind of
Yeah.
is like this full 360 thing
Yeah.
that has to happen. So I'm curious, with the companies that I know that there is a real world example also that you reference in your book, a few examples, but where do you see companies needing to start in order to effectively run an open transition program? Does it have to start with the culture of the company, or does it
It's
start
got to
like
start with a
grassroots?
culture. It's
Yeah.
got to start with a psychological safety so people can have these conversations. If you do the system, it starts with this promise that no one will be asked to walk to the door by just starting a conversation or asking the question, because that brings employees to come forward to be like, it's always better if it's employee led. It's much better if the employee's like, hey, like, I don't think this is working out. Like, what are
Yeah.
some options here? If they think they're going to get fired that day, they're never going to say that. So
Right.
you start these earlier conversations, you do these check-ins, you collect this data, and you managers, this is managers, not HR, really have to. HR can help support it. They got to dive in and start these conversations. And I always say
Yeah.
every problem's got a root, right? And the earlier you can get to the root, to the better. So there are three common roots. So Traci, again, which, she's disconnected, not showing up to work on time, bunch of stuff going on, right? Eventually this will turn into a mess because I'll stop trusting her or whatever. But like, what's the why? Well, there could be things that the employee has to fix, and that are circumstantials. There are the things that the employer can and can't want to fix, and then there's things the employer won't change. So the problem is we treat the symptom. The symptom is you have a headache, and I give you a Tylenol. That's like a performance improvement plan. But it's not the cause. One person might have a headache because they're dehydrated. One person may be gluten intolerant, and one person might have a brain tumor, right? So like the Tylenol is not really the solution. If you're trying to get to the diagnostic, you'd say, you know what? Traci lost her childcare and she's really distracted and overwhelmed and coming to work. And we need a conversation about, look, Traci, you're going to need to fix this, but like, we can rearrange your hours, and please communicate me and let me know what's going on. But this is sort of something changed outside of work that's impacting work performance. Traci's pissed maybe because she knows we hired 3 people at a higher salary than her that have started, that are doing more work, and now is honest about like, hey, look, I'm just really frustrated. I think you know what? We screwed this up. Like, um, you know what, you deserve a promotion, we need to fix your boss, you get the rate, like, we agree with it, the employer, or you want to go back to the marketing team, you're struggling on the sales team. So these are the things where we agree, and we can solve it. So now these problems go from orange back to green. Then there's the things that
Mhm.
don't change. So Traci said she was all in on a company of remote work. Turns out she really doesn't like it, and it's really hard. And so that's like, hey, Traci, we're not going to get offices. So, let's talk about what that might mean, and how we could help you. So what's interesting is, again, these you're in some green, it's yellow, you have these conversations. I think then they all go back to green versus they go to orange and to red. The
Mm-hmm.
last one goes to green, but it goes to green on a Traci, let's help you find a different job. It doesn't have to
Mm-hmm.
be today. It doesn't have to be next month, but we're not getting offices. And these other things, we fix the root. If we didn't do that and we just said, Traci, you've been disengaged, I'm going to put you on a PIP, you need to be better, like we're just going to be here in a few months, but I haven't figured out what's actually wrong, right? That is the number one. That's why I hate PIPs. I think they're look, if you're giving someone a PIP because you want to fire them and
Oh, wow.
you've
Yeah.
been told by your HR team that that's going to help you legally, that is horrible advice.
Yeah,
And
that is
asterisks,
horrible advice.
I'm not a lawyer, do not take any professional advice. People sue because they feel disrespected. Being
Yeah,
put on a
it's
PIP to
true.
fail versus having an honest discussion, with them, like it's just really bad advice.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think if there's anyone listening who's like, "Oh yeah, I do that as a measure to ensure that there's a less risk," you are probably creating a little bit more risk in some ways.
Right, because they feel like they were set up to fail. You just want to
Yes.
document their failure, right?
Yes. And I'll tell you candidly, I've worked for a handful of organizations, and I've worked for organizations that are so risk averse and so afraid of litigation that is, even though the intention is for someone to succeed, the way forward is to ensure there's documentation, even if there's a 90% chance that that person won't succeed. And I've also worked for organizations that are like, look, we had to really be very upfront with this person. Documentation doesn't actually matter. They need to know where they stand. And I think that there's
With the care
some,
part that we
yes,
talked
with the
about, right?
care,
Yeah.
emphasis on that. I do think that there's a bit of a balance. Like documentation is necessary for people who need documentation, but it's certainly not a way to prevent risk. The best thing that you can do is to treat people with kindness and consideration and fairly, emphasis to me on the fair.
Yeah.
But when I think about all of this in the perspective of how people are treated, fundamentally, the more open we are with people, and even though that might feel like an uncomfortable thing for some people, because sometimes transparency is a very difficult skill for people,
Yeah.
because I do think it's a skill, there is so much importance there. And when I think about what you've said, as far as like how leaders are like, hey, this is not really something that feels like it's working out. Let's figure out what that transition looks like. Let's help you get there. I also agree that I think if that comes from the employee, it's probably the best
So much better to be
situation.
employee
So
led.
much better. You have so
Yeah.
much more control over that. And
Agency. Yeah.
yes, so much more agency. And the organization is like, whew, I'm so glad that they realize what's going
You
on
want
here.
people to be coming up and saying, I think this isn't working. I think I want to do something different. And
Yes.
rather than
Yeah.
paying them a severance, pay them to keep working there. There's just to go back. There's a famous study that was done by insurance companies to figure
Mm.
out who sues their doctors. And so they listened to and they looked at records of patient mistakes and operating room, whatever, and they recorded phone conversations. And it turns out at the end of the day, it had no correlation to the mistakes that the doctors made. It had a high correlation to the ones who talked disrespectfully to their patients on the phone.
There you go. Yeah, I'm not surprised by that, because when people feel uh treated like they're treated with respect, their overall like summary of a situation is so different. I mean, it kind of goes back to what you mentioned at the top of our conversation, where it's like, this is th- when people resign, when people leave organizations, it's not often seen without this emotional connection,
Right.
similar to a marriage, a dissolution of a marriage. And when you remove this, like, they're against me, they're rude to me, they don't like me, they're rude. When you remove that and you actually treat people with respect, and it's kind of just like a frank discussion, at least when we think about, again, the employee employer relationship,
Yeah.
things are just a lot more clear.
Yeah. If you're pulling 20-year-olds these days and you're sort of like, they're like, look, it's been awesome. It's been a great 18 months. It's just time to do something different, and like, if you approach that with that is treasonous, like, look, I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but you're gonna have a hard time hiring any employees because they're just like, look, it's even, they're like, it's great. I want to do something different. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, generationally, there is a huge difference. related to how like each generation interacts with work. I mean, millennials like myself, at least I can say, we're raised probably by and large by boomers and baby boomers, and so there's this emphasis on you just do the job, don't get fired, and even, even if you do a bad job, like, don't look for something else, just keep going. You can't leave a job unless you have another job. And then you have Gen Z, who really doesn't feel so indebted to organizations in the same way. And it's like, if I'm not having a good experience, it doesn't matter if I have another job lined up. I'm going to go and find something else.
Right, because I'll live at home with mom and
Yeah.
dad. By the way, I enjoy so much as a Gen Xer now listening to millennials trash on Gen Z, because like we were doing the like millennial thing
Yeah,
for a
totally.
while, so because it gets blurred a little bit at the
Yes.
crossover, and now
Yeah.
millennials are like, I am not Gen Z. Let's be clear, like it's
Totally. But I have to say, I find a lot of inspiration in the way that
yeah,
Gen Z interacts with the world around them. Like they, coming back to this idea of challenging the status quo, that is totally
right.
within their
I,
grasp.
I love the look. We shouldn't do harm and do this and whatever, but that has to be balanced with like
Yeah.
at 22-year-old, you are not God's gift to the
No,
organization,
totally,
and
totally.
and
Yeah.
like you probably
There's a
need
lot
to
to learn.
do some learning. Yeah.
Yes, a lot to learn, a lot to learn. Totally. I know. Do we sound like our parents right now? Probably.
Yes. Yes.
I'm curious though, like when we're talking a lot about, you know, the bright side to what happens when there's this open transition within an organization and psychological safety. But is there a real breakdown that happens when people are so open, like, because you kind of are relying on the recipient of this openness, whether it's the employer or the employee, as well as the other party, to really be at the same level of like understanding, maturity, open and honest conversation, all of that. But is there I ask this because I
Yeah.
imagine that the reason why some of this doesn't happen is because of fear. People are either afraid of losing their
Yeah.
jobs and,
Look,
afraid
and
of
again,
losing their
from their
team members.
parents, like this isn't what you do. And we had this program forever, and people would still give 2 weeks notice. And I was so frustrated. We would have to realize I have to repeat it 7 times, like
Yeah.
everything in organization. And then we started offering incentives. Hey, we have a bonus if you give 90 days notice. Like you had to start really like putting your mouth in and telling the stories and sharing the stories, because you were going against an ingrained multi-generational mindset. And
Mm,
and again, that if if a Gen Zer's parents heard about one of these programs at a company, the device still might be, don't do that, take care of yourself, get it all buttoned up, leave 2 weeks, like again, that's just what that's what they knew,
yeah.
from that, where it really was the dissolution of a marriage. So get your lawyer, before you do it. So
Yeah.
I do think, and there's just look, like there's more conflict avoidance, there's more, but I want to be clear, this is 100% on the company. You should not do this stuff as an employee, or go do this if your company is not have this level of psychological safety. This is 100% on the company to set the environment, and then ask people to step up into that and make sure that they are never, they are never kind of violated for doing that.
Right, right. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know that there, at least from my memory, there was an example that you referenced in the book, which was around like the successful implementation of the open transition program, and that it led to higher engagement and smoother transitions and things like that. But and so I love that there's an example of this, and I totally could see why. I'm wondering though, what do you say to companies or maybe even leaders who say, oh, well, if people know that they're leaving, or if they're in this transition, they're not going to really do the work. They're just going to like stop working. They're only going to be
Yeah.
focused on interviewing, and there's going to be like a lack of
That
productivity.
is the most common objection.
Hmm.
And I will say that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. So what they're basically saying there, people are always like, they'll steal stuff. I'm like, look, like you're assuming the people in your organization that are problematic are not the ones that quit and leave. They're the ones that quit and stay. So there's a Traci who decided 9 months ago she is leaving as soon as she gets a job. She has stopped working, stopped paying attention, started copying all the files that she wants to copy, because no one's looking, right? So this is kind of just an ignorance is bliss mindset, versus
Yeah.
a 90-day period. We're helping Traci, we're watching Traci, like Traci benefits by ending this stuff well. I find that argument doesn't hold water. I also like the notion that if everyone is leaving your company stealing stuff and toxic and a ball of flames, you are either hiring horrible people or something about your culture is doing this to them. And both of those require a little bit of introspection.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like, is everything okay over there?
Yeah. Are
Probably
people
not.
constantly leaving and stealing stuff? It's like, again, let's look inside on this
Also,
one.
like, who hurt you? like, why are you
Right.
so upset? Why are you so hurt?
Right.
It does also like lead me to wonder if there are jobs that you've seen that maybe are less effective or more effective with this, or does it just apply to every job?
Yeah, look, you would want it to. If you're running an assembly line, and I don't mean maybe not even, literally, but figuratively, or call center, and someone's just plug and play into another seat, then this might have less efficacy, and it's high turnover and people are coming in and coming out. I think this matters the most in professional services, because
I agree.
these are businesses where if you ever look, whether it's your insurance agent or marketing or otherwise, the thing you hate as a customer is turnover on your account management or relation side, because it feels like starting
Yeah.
over, right?
Yeah.
Every time. So you hate that. And the more sudden it is, the more it puts people look at those changes as opportunities to opt out, right? Well, I haven't loved this agency for years, but Traci was great. Now Traci's going away. So your ability to bring in someone else for a couple months, have them pair up, build that relationship. I think the 2 weeks notice is the highest risk for folks in the professional service business, because our clients hate when we train. They even hate when we promote them, and they have to move up on their account.
Yeah, totally, totally. Because all that matters and for them is that they have continuity and they have someone paying attention to their business. I mean,
Yeah.
it's reasonable. I get it. Like when people are paying you for a service and then there are changes there. I mean, it is the riskiest thing for a business when there is change in that area. And so often, businesses that have customer facing employees, they are sometimes the most vulnerable
Yeah.
to changes because customers are not always easy. Like we know customer service is a very difficult thing. And so it's also, it makes me wonder how businesses can also protect their most vulnerable populations in these professional
Yeah.
services. But that said, and I know we kind of touched on it earlier on, what are some, especially with the cultural discussion, but what are some simple steps that companies can take in order to start this, open transition program in their organizations?
Yeah, so they're kind of 7 steps in a program. Look, the foundational thing is the psychological safety in these conversations and this getting to the root of problems. That's how you ideally you would fix half of these things, right?
Mhm.
Person's in the wrong seat, they didn't get a raise, so you never even get to that. But if you do get to the point where look, this isn't working either structurally or otherwise, the 7 steps are kind of having a written plan, being super clear, no expectations about this is what it is, this is the timetable. That's the second thing. That's where we made some mistakes kind of in our first one. Clear communications. Hey, I'm interviewing, I'm in the finalist for this role. If I get it, they're going to probably, I might have given you 3 months, but obviously someone moves quickly, they're going to take that job. They're not going to say, can you
Right.
hold on to me? Think opening your Rolodex, and making recommendations, being helpful, being honest. Look, the person was in a here doing this and they really want a product management role and we don't have it. I think they would thrive in this role. I just had one of those similar conversations of someone who, my advice when they were leaving our organization was, you should be doing this, not this. And so I'm happy to make recommendations, for that. Providing internal resources. Again, your HR team can help with interview prep, can help to explain why they're leaving, can help with resume kind of stuff. And then sometimes even third-party support, whether it's recruiters, co-working spaces, or other things that can help. So those are sort of 7 components if you want to try to actually run the transition program.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. And I think all of this in my mind also translates to how we really remove the stigma around people leaving companies. I mean, I remember someone said to me in a past company, like, why do we never talk about when someone has left?
Yeah.
Like we never say bye to that person. It's kind of just like one day they're there and one day they're not. And the answer at that time was like, oh, well, we don't want to focus on people leaving because, we don't want other people to start to worry about the
Right.
stability of an organization. But realistically, it doesn't matter if people are leaving,
No.
because whether people want to leave or not, they're already thinking about it, regardless of whether people are staying or they're leaving. But that there's definitely a stigma. There's definitely a stigma, and at
I
least in
like it
most
as right.
organizations.
I like it as no fault car insurance. So
Mm,
I like saying, look, Traci's gonna be moving on. She's joining our alumni program. People that leave are alumni or becoming an alumni. We wish Traci the best of luck. I think it's up for Traci, unless someone's been at the company for a year and a senior level. We don't have them address that. Um, I know there's companies that really celebrate leaving, and I think that's confusing too. And I
yeah,
think I don't let, and then you start getting fairness things. So if people want to throw a party or do something, that's a peer thing. The
I
company, we
agree.
don't do anything as a company
No,
to
yeah.
celebrate people leaving or getting a cake. So they can say, oh, well, they did I'm like, Traci's team did that. Like maybe she was more honest with them or nicer with them or otherwise. Right. But we just say really nicely, they're moving on. It is the same whether they left or we asked them to leave. It's kind of that no fault insurance,
Yes.
and they're joining our alumni. And I think people, what they see is that you're nice, you're respectful. I stop it at I don't want to celebrate that people are leaving. I just want to acknowledge respectfully that they're moving on.
Yeah, I like that. Joining the alumni program. Now everyone has another tool in their tool belt, so to speak, on how they can talk about someone who's decided to leave or who has made the decision. Um, well, listen, there's so much to this. I think that the listeners hopefully have gained a lot of insight around how they can reduce the stigma and also help their organizations and their employees move forward from the role that they're currently in a way that's more productive, more open, and more psychologically safe. So thank you, Robert, for joining my podcast and sharing all of that. I know that you want to share a little bit more about your book and where everyone can access it. So I'll pass the mic to you, so to speak.
Oh,
Where can
sure.
everyone find that?
Yeah, if you go to robertglazer.com, glazer.com, you can find my books or otherwise. Actually, if you click on the Friday Forward tab, which is my newsletter, which is Substack, that's where you can actually access it. It's right there. You can read the first, I think it's even 3 or 4 chapters for free on Substack, and see if it interests you, and I think you'll get some takeaways from those chapters either way.
I think so. Amazing. Well, we'll have all of that linked for all of the listeners. And thank you again so much for joining us on the podcast. And maybe for your next book, you'll come back on and, for lucky number 7, which
we'll
if you get
we can talk about it. It's about helping people and employees figure out their own personal core values. So
there you go. A very important subject for sure. I didn't even realize that you were working on book number 7. So
I always got one in the hopper. So.
I love it. I love it. Well, good luck. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.